It's my birthday! I have been alive for 50 years now and a reader for almost all of those. So my parents tell the story that I was reading at 2. I don't remember being 2, so I can't verify that, but I know that I was reading when I was 4. My earliest memories are of being 4, and I could read. I have memories of reading to my younger siblings when I was that age. So it happened really, really early. So I was thinking, what did I want to do with this day? Who did I want to spend it with? And I wanted to spend at least a part of it with you. So this video is probably going to be kind of long. So strap in, grab a drink, grab your favorite snack, get a piece of cake in my honor, and I am going to talk about books for each and every year that I have been alive. One book per year of my life. I got this idea actually from Books and Lala. She did something similarly. I don't remember if it was her birthday or not, but she found them the same way that I did. So if you go into Goodreads, there is a place there to find a list of all of the books that were released per year, and they're in popularity order. Now, I do not know if that means like sales popularity or popularity as far as Goodreads ratings or shelving, or exactly how they decided what popularity was, but it's still a great list nonetheless. And I was able to do a lot of finding of great books. Some I haven't thought about in a long time, some that I've actually read recently, even though they came out quite a while ago. So I am going to just start at the very beginning with 1973. In 1973, The Princess Bride by William Goldman was released, the book version. I love this book so much. If you've only seen the movie, I cannot more strongly suggest the book. They are pretty similar. The plot lines run right along each other. There are things though from the book that they had to cut, probably for financial reasons or time, or because they might bore people. I'm talking about the hats. If you know, you know. So there's a big thing about hats at the very beginning of the book that is not in the film. The big thing that's missing in the film is the tree. So in the book, the tree has like 10 levels that they had to get down before they got to Wesley at the very bottom. And there was all of this hijinks ensuing all over the place. In the film, they just go in the door and down like one set of stairs, and there he is. So that was a big chunk. That's a big, I'm not going to say it was a chunk of the book time-wise, but that was a big thing in the book that was left out of the film. But I strongly, strongly, strongly suggest the book. It was so wonderful. 1974, Stephen King's Carrie was released. I believe that this was his first big popular novel. He'd been published a lot in like literary magazines and horror magazines and all of that. In case you are too young to know this, back in the day, there used to be a lot of magazines that would publish short stories in different genres. There were romance ones, horror ones, sci-fi ones, mystery ones, and I don't know how many of those still exist, at least in paper form. I think there might be, I'm pretty sure there are still some electronically you can see online, but back in the day, you put them in magazines. So, I digress. Stephen King was published previously, but I think Carrie was his first novel. In case you are unfamiliar, Carrie is the story of a horrifically abused and bullied teenage girl who has telekinesis, and well, the hijinks then ensue. It's really good. I'm not gonna say it's super scary, in part because it's kind of the bad guys who get hurt and the good guy who gets the power or who has the power and taps into their power and kind of goes at them. So that's not scary. That was kind of like, okay, well, you played stupid games and now you've won the stupid prizes. 1975 is when Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt was released. I, of course, did not read this in 75. I read this with my daughter when she was either at the end of middle school or in early high school. It's been a while. I feel like either we buddy read it because she had it as a summer reading project, or she had read it and told me how much she loved it, and then I read it on her recommendation. I can't remember which it was, but I do know that it was about her. I do know it's a beautiful, sweet story. I totally recommend it. I wish I could give you a little bit more as far as plotline than that, but like I said, it's my daughter's through college and she's married and all of this, so it's been a long time, and yeah. But if you like that kind of cusp between middle grade and high school, and you like character-based stories or a little bit of fantasy twist to it, I strongly suggest it. 1976 brought us Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. And I don't want to offend anyone when I say this. I'm speaking about popularity, not about plotline, but it was the twilight of its time. These vampire books were what the Twilight vampire books were to its generation. Very different feel to them. They were much kind of scarier. They were, I'm gonna say, deeper. It's been a long time, but they were heavier than what the Twilight series was, and there wasn't a lot of protecting the humans and all of that stuff. They were monsters, even though they didn't all necessarily want to be monsters, and that's kind of how that went. So if that sounds good to you and you haven't had a chance, or you're wondering like what was Gen X's Twilight series, it was the Interview with the Vampire series, and go read it. It's awesome. 1977, The Shining by Stephen King. And this is another one of the places where I'm going to say the book, please don't hate me, but the book was so much better than the film, especially the first film. I think the second film was a little bit closer to what the book was doing, but in the book, it's a perfectly, I'm not going to say wonderful man, but it's a regular man who's trying to do the best that he can, and he is slowly losing his mind, and that's kind of how he becomes dangerous. In the film, he was just like a boogeyman. He was just a scary guy, and there wasn't the depth to it that was in the book. And so if you have not read the book, you just watched the movie, I strongly suggest that you read the book. It is much more psychological. It's kind of a study on alcoholism and mental degradation caused by excessive alcohol consumption, and I'm going to leave it there because there's other things in the book that add to what's going on in Mr. Torrance's head. And 1978 brings us my favorite Stephen King book of all time, old and new, and that is The Stand. The Stand is a post-apocalyptic story where there has been a really bad disease and most of the world's population has died either from the disease or from the fall of civilization afterwards. And there are two big powers that are kind of mentally in their dreams calling people to them, and that is Mother Abigail on one side and the Walking Dude on the other. And the hijinks ensue. We're following all of these different groups of people as they slowly come together. We get the multi-POV before it was ever super popular. Now it's almost difficult to find books without it. But back then, this was new and novel kind of thing, or at least it was to me. And it's over 1,000 pages, and I've read it, I think, 3 times, maybe 4, and I loaned out my last copy and I don't have it anymore, so it's on my list of things. Maybe I'll get it for myself for my birthday, who knows. But The Stand by Stephen King, it is worth every single one of those pages. 1979 brought something that is actually on my shelf, and that is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. It is a really amazing kind of, I guess you would call it sci-fi time travel-y story where a young woman, for reasons she has no idea, suddenly gets really dizzy, really sick. She falls down and she wakes up, and she is what, 140 or so, 120 years in the past, prior to the Civil War, where she is black, and she rescues a young white boy who is drowning, and they try to kill her for it. And the hijinks just go from there. It's heart-wrenching, it's fascinating, it's all of the things, And I cannot, if you haven't read it, I cannot more strongly suggest that you give it a shot, seriously. So 1980 brings us Stephen King's Firestarter, and I actually have a Firestarter story, so I'm gonna have to talk faster about other books so I can tell my story. So when I was in high school, I had a high school history teacher who didn't like to actually actively teach. So what he did, every Monday you'd come into class and he would have the entire chalkboard covered, or whiteboard, I can't even remember which it was, but it was just covered in notes, just in tiny writing. You just column after column after column of just kind of historical facts about whatever thing that we were supposed to be studying. And on that Monday, our job was to copy them all down. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, he would read to us from books that he had written because he didn't want to be a teacher, he wanted to be an author. Friday, we took a test on the notes that were on the board. So he'd just give us a printed out sheet and he'd have removed key terms. So we were supposed to basically have just memorized all of those facts and then spit them back out on Friday. So I can't claim to have learned anything in that class. Everything just went into short-term memory. I did well grade-wise because I could memorize them the night before, but I don't think I remembered them 2 days later. But anyway, why this is a Firestarter thing is because all of his books that he wrote were just kind of like a fanfic rewrite version of Stephen King stories. And so the only one I really remember distinctly was his rewrite of Firestarter, which he would never admit that some kids even said this is like Stephen King, and he said this is nothing like Stephen King. But it was Firestarter, except for she didn't just start fires, she used electricity to start fires. And it was her and her dad, and the government was chasing them. It's literally the exact same story, just rewritten, where she can channel electricity to then cause a fire. And yeah, that's Firestarter. The book is really good, the movie was really good, and I strongly recommend both. 1981 is the first book that I'm pretty sure I read when it came out, and it was Ramona Quimby, Age 8 by Beverly Cleary, and I was age 8, and I'm pretty sure they made a big deal about, because when you're in school everyone's pretty much the same age, so they made a big deal about this book and it being us the same age, and so I think we all ended up reading it. I can't remember exactly how that went, but I do remember Ramona Quimby, age 8, I was 8. I thought that was pretty cool. 1982 is when Alice Walker published The Color Purple, and I really enjoyed the book. I loved the original movie, and I cannot wait for the new film. If I'm understanding correctly, the new film is basically the musical version filmed. So it's not just a remake of the original movie that came out in the 90s, was it? Early 90s? So instead, it is a film adaptation of the musical version. So hopefully it's going to have those songs, because oh my goodness, do I love those songs. And I am totally here for it. I know there's been a ton of Stephen King. There's more. 1983 was the release of Pet Sematary, and I loved this one. I'm thinking this might have actually been my first Stephen King that I ever read, even though I've talked about others that came out beforehand. I think I read this one, obviously not when I was 10. I know I read it in high school, so it might be one of, if not the first Stephen King that I ever read. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the original movie. I didn't understand the changes they made in the remake of the film. They seem to be changes for no good reason, but they didn't ask me, so that's where it is. But it's great. This one is scary. This one I would absolutely say is in the right genre. It is totally horror. It is all sorts of scary stuff. 1984 was the year that The House on Mango Street was published by Sandra Cisneros. I did not read this until graduate school. I read it in one of my teaching classes, and it's just lovely, and I do wish that I had read it back when I was younger, but I didn't, and I cannot more strongly suggest, if you've not read it, if you've not read any Sandra Cisneros, give it a shot. It's just absolutely lovely. 1985, it's right back here. 1985, The Handmaid's Tale. I want to say I also read this the first time in high school. I've read it multiple times over the years. I am tempted by the newer hardcover that matches the Testaments, but I've had this for forever and it's followed me through multiple moves, so I absolutely love it. I have loved this from the first time that I read it. It was shocking, it was scary, it was all of the things, and then as I've gotten older and seen what happens in our world, it's gotten just scarier and scarier. We could just move this to horror, I guess. But if you're familiar with the series, this book ends where season 1 ends. That's the end of it. There is a little postscript that doesn't quite fit what's going on with the series. But other than that, all of the events in here pretty much line up with the way that they did season 1 of the series on Hulu. So if you liked that and kind of wanted it in book form, or were interested in that but wanted to read the book first, absolutely read the book first. It is worth every second of your time and emotional energy that you put into it. And he's back. 1986, Stephen King's It, which I also did read in high school. The ending bugged me just like it bugs, I think, everybody. He even made fun of himself in the latest film version with everyone telling him how bad the ending is. They pretend it was something else, but yeah, I'm glad that they changed the ending for the film. That was a good choice. I also really enjoyed the original, I think it was a television miniseries. So there used to be, before there was streaming, for those of you youngsters out there, we used to have these things called miniseries on TV where like they would take that Netflix series that's on for 6 episodes, but they would make it 3 episodes and it would air like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or something like that. And it would be a huge to-do. We've got this great new miniseries coming out, and everybody would just be over the moon for them. And The Stand actually did also have a mini series, but it had its own miniseries. John Ritter was in it. It was really good. So I also very much enjoyed the new movie, even though I do not like horror. And yes, it is horror to the nth degree. It is 100% correct. It's not, yes, you could probably do some lit analysis of there being deeper meaning, but on that surface, it's scary. It really is scary. And as a total complete 180, 1987 saw the release of Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fannie Flagg. And this book is so good. The film is also brilliant. I will say I watched the movie first. It's just called Fried Green Tomatoes. They didn't use the whole title. And I saw the movie probably multiple times. I was absolutely in love with it, and then went back and read the book and loved it just as much. Of course, the characters all looked like the characters in the film because I'd already seen them, which is why I don't like to watch the films first. I want to make them in my head first. But the book is so good and so quintessential, kind of Southern back in the day kind of thing, I think is the best way to kind of put it. It's just lovely. It's heart-wrenching. It's small-town Southern life. It's 2 absolute best friends who are more than best friends in the book, but the movie made them just friends, and kind of the expectations of Southern society and how over-the-top important reputation is, and all of that kind of thing. It's just wonderful, and I'm not doing it justice. You should totally read it if you haven't. Find a copy. They're probably fairly inexpensive these days, and give it a read. 1988 was the first one that shocked me because I feel like I would have read this when I was younger, but I was 15 in 1988, and that is when Matilda by Roald Dahl was released, which it feels like a book of my childhood, but it's not, because I was already 15, but it's so good. If you haven't read the book, yes, it's a children's book, still read the book, and totally see the film, both film versions. The original film version is great, and the musical film version is also great, and they're both just, all of it is brilliant, and I can't more strongly suggest it, even though, like I said, I couldn't have been a kid when I read it because I was 15 when it came out, and I don't think I read it when it first came out, so I would have been late teens, early 20s maybe. But it still feels like, I guess because it feels like my childhood, I don't know. But, except I'm not magic. 1989 was when the Joy Luck Club came out. And I want to say I read this close to the time it came out. I'm pretty sure I got it from the library. I was a really big library user back then. And I feel like I keep wanting to say it was part of Oprah's book club, but I don't think so. I think it was just something that was getting a lot of press. A lot of people were talking about it, and so I read it. I can't remember anything about the plot right now. I can't remember too much about it, but I do remember I absolutely loved it at the time. And so Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. 1990 is the year that Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman released Good Omens, and it is still one of my all-time favorite books. I want to say the first time I read it would have been fairly close to its release, maybe not 90, but right around there. And I do own a copy. I can't show it to you because it is in my classroom right now, but it's so good. It is about, well, there's also a series on it now, and the book and that first season, I haven't seen the second season of the series, but the book follows that first season fairly well. So it is the story of what is supposed to be the apocalypse, but everything just gets absolutely turned upside down and sideways, and the Antichrist goes to get raised by regular parents, and some regular kid goes to get raised to be the Antichrist, and hijinks just absolutely ensue all over the place. It's so good. It's hilarious. It's funny. It does make commentary about kind of that nature versus nurture kind of thing. How much of who we are is ingrained, and how much can we change circumstances by the way that we treat people. And it's really good. You should give it a shot. 1991 saw the release of Needful Things by Stephen King. I said The Stand is my favorite all-time Stephen King. That is true. Needful Things is my second favorite from the, I'm going to say, old school Stephen King. My favorite from new school Stephen King is Dr. Sleep, but my favorite from back in the day is Needful Things. So the basic plot, if you are unfamiliar, there's a small town in Maine. This dapper man comes in with basically a junk shop, but customers come in and they find that one thing that somehow hits them nostalgically just right, or they think that their life will be complete if they have this. It is something that they end up becoming completely obsessive over, and believe that they can't possibly afford this thing. This thing is too perfect. And he lets them get it for a super reasonable price, plus maybe you can do me a favor later. And so he ends up coming in and totally like dismantling this town and turning people. It's so good. It is so well crafted. It is so well sewn together. I don't know why this one doesn't get more talk. I think this is probably more horrific because it can happen. Not like the whole he's like magical kind of thing, but the whole like how obsessive people get about stuff and things to the detriment of people and their communities and all of that. And it's just, if you have not read this one, give this one a read. If you're like, I want to try a Stephen King, I don't know where to start, Needful Things. Try Needful Things. absolutely have to do a Stephen King video at some point, and it will be at the top of my list. Needful Things is so, so good. 1992 is when John Grisham released The Pelican Brief, and I loved this. I want to say that this was I'd read lots of mysteries. When I was little, he's not on this list because he wasn't on the Goodreads list, but I was obsessed with Encyclopedia Brown mysteries and all of those. I loved those. But this, for me, was my first, like, suspense thriller with also the mystery genre, and I absolutely was in love from beginning to end. I loved the book. I loved the movie. Julia Roberts is in the film. But the book it just had me like by the heart squeezing the whole time. And I was like, oh, well, you should do this. And then she would do this and it would go horrifically wrong. And I'm like, oh my God, I would totally die in this world. This would not be good for me. And over and over and over again, that kept happening. And absolutely, if you haven't read this one, give it a try. I'm positive you can find it at thrift stores or Goodwill or something like that for a really cheap price. I know your library price still has some copies. Give it a shot. If you have any inkling that you might really enjoy a really good, solidly crafted suspense thriller, give it a shot. So 1993 is the year that The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides was released, and it is also still one of my all-time favorite books. And this is where you're gonna see this is my paper. I am so heartbroken because this is my copy. You can see right there that it is what I say it is. Yep, upside down. You can see right there, hopefully you can read that. The light is getting bright, then dim, then bright, then dim, then bright, then dim. But yeah, so I used to do this thing where I would take off the covers when I read the book, and like, I don't know where they went, but half the time I couldn't find them again. I didn't think anything about it. But I believe that this is a first edition. I got it when it came out, and it's naked, and I feel horrible, and I really wish I had the cover. I keep kicking myself. I've moved so many. It's not here. It's not anywhere. I haven't had it for probably a good decade, if not two. But yeah, I wish I still had it. This is beautiful, and if I had the chance to teach this, I would. I feel like there's a lot in it that would really speak to my students, especially my students who aren't necessarily readers, but I think this would be a good book that would suck them in and flip that reader switch on. It is the story of a family with all daughters, and one of their daughters has some mental health issues. She ends up attempting suicide, and the parents' reaction to that is to lock everything down, and my kids aren't going to grow up anymore. They're not going to be out in the world. They're not going to change. We're going to keep everything as preserved, and we're going to just keep everything here, and no one's growing up, and no one's changing, and nothing is ever going to happen again. And the more you try to hold on and lock things down, if you can't grow, then you're dying and you're decaying. And just watching what happens to this family, and it's so well done and so beautiful. And I hate that I lost the cover, but I still have this book because I love it that much. And yeah. 1994 is the year that Anne Lamott released Bird by Bird. I also did not read this until graduate school. I don't have it here because it's in my classroom. It's great, especially for folks who have an interest in writing, not like, ooh, here's how you get published type writing. That's not what this is. It's a, hey, here's how you can express that part of yourself in writing, even if it's just for yourself, because being a writer doesn't include the publishing part. That's a totally different aspect. But she really focuses on kind of focusing on you and focusing on drafts and focusing on creating written art that you are proud of. Forget what other people like or don't like, or read or don't read, or buy or don't buy. It's about that kind of connection to yourself, and it's so good. You totally should give it a shot. 1995 is my only Nick Hornby on the list. It's when he released High Fidelity, but I'm going to tell you, through the night, through probably 95 on, through the rest of the 90s, I was obsessed with Nick Hornby. I don't understand how There have to be some somewhere in this house that's not in this room, because I went and looked. I can't find them. But I loved High Fidelity. I loved About a Boy. I had his book of short stories. I'm not a short story person, but the story Nipple Jesus is my favorite short story of all time. So they have to be here somewhere. I just don't know where, unless something happened in the move, in which case I probably want to replace them, just because there was a lot of years in there where he was my be-all end-all when it came to writers. I absolutely adored him. So High Fidelity, there was a film made with John Cusack playing the lead, and he perfectly fit this main character. It is about a guy who has kind of run over a lot of women and been in relationships where he wasn't the best of boyfriends, and then when he gets his heart broken, he decides he's going to go and try to find these other women and discuss like what happened and all of that. And he's so selfish and he's so self-centered, but he's also so sweet and relatable, and that's really hard to do in one character, and Nick Hornby does it so well. It's a wonderful book and film. And another thing that I was totally obsessed with, and in this kind of genre, there's a few more things coming up, but 1996 is when Bridget Jones' Diary came out, and I loved this book. I read this one, I read the sequel, I loved the film with Renee Zellweger. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. So much that was being released at the time focused on men, like High Fidelity. I love Nick Hornby, I loved his characters, but there was the guy, and then he was trying to like deal with women, but the women were always the sub characters. There weren't a lot of like, let's focus on women and what they're really like. But Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding was so different and so kind of relatable in a weird way, and there were parts where you just cringe for her, but there's never a part when you stop just feeling for her. And it opened my eyes to a lot more things in reading, and I really started seeking out, I think, more female writers. Yeah, I just enjoyed just stories about women that weren't huge, big events, but about life. I really loved that. 1997 is when the very first Harry Potter came out. I did not start reading them until, I want to say, the third book was coming out or had come out. I'd gone to a number of the release midnight parties, which, speaking of, my local Books A Million is doing a midnight release party for the second in the Fourth Wing series, the Iron... Oh, it's flown out of my head. But the sequel to Fourth Wing is getting a midnight release party. And I am this close to going ahead and taking the next day off work and going to the midnight release party, because I haven't been to one in forever. And just because you're 50 doesn't mean you can't go to midnight release parties for books, because if you can't do it now, then what else is there left in the world? 1998 is when George R.R. Martin released A Clash of Kings, the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire. I'm not going to get up and get them, but I have all of them over there. I have not read all of them. They are very big, they are very long, they are very involved, and I don't want to keep going until I have all of them. At this point, I would rather know that I can get to the end, and I don't want to have, who knows, it might be another 5-6 years, and I know already that I'm going to have, even though I've watched the series multiple times, I really want to go back in the books and reread them, and so I don't want to keep going knowing that that's more books that I would need to reread before I could get to the end. So when the end happens, then there will be a good old probably year of making sure I get one of these books every month or two read to get to the end. 1999 was the release of Laurie Halse Anderson's Speak, and it is so powerful. It is a book that is on a number of banned book lists right now, and I do not get it at all. If it bothers you, you probably need to read it more than if it doesn't bother you. It is a YA book about a young woman who had something horrific happen to her over the summer. She starts school in the fall. None of her friends are speaking to her. She's had a major personality shift. Her grades are dropping. All of those big signs that tell you that there is something going on with this child. She needs help. And kind of finding out what happened and all of that. It's so good. It's so powerful. It's so important. If your child's school is banning it and you have a probably 8th to 9th grader, get them the book. Have them, like, get it for kids who can't purchase books. It's important. It's not something that we're going to act like it doesn't happen and then that'll keep it from happening, because that's not how this world works. Okay, 2000s was another one of those fun women books, and it is Sophie Kinsella's Confessions of a Shopaholic. I was so enamored with this entire series. There's a couple of more of the books in this series on this list because they came out in the subsequent years, and those were the top of my list books for all of those. I had the best time. They was just fun. She was just young. She was, I guess, close to my age, maybe a little bit younger than me at the time. And she made terrible decisions, but she managed to work her way out of her terrible choices, and she managed to find ways to find her own strength to fix the things that she broke. And I loved that. I just had a blast. It was just fun. She was just fun to hang out with, and the characters were fun to hang out with. And I don't know that I don't think I've read stuff that's quite that fun in a while, and I really miss that. 2001 is the year that Neil Gaiman released American Gods, and yes, I have the first edition with the cover still on. Go me. I love this book. This is still in my list of top favorite books. It is still one that I recommend. It was supposed to be in my list of books that I want to reread, but the list got really long, and I thought, well, I'm going to keep it to the things that I need to reread for series, but this is one that I want to reread, not because of anything that follows it, even though it does have a sequel, A Nancy Boys, which I also have on my shelf. But it's wonderful. So this is the story of a man named Shadow, and he's in prison. He's waiting to get out to go back to his wife and back to his life. And on the bus ride home, he meets a man named Mr. Wednesday. And if you know mythology, you know who Wednesday is. And I'm just going to say from right there, hijinks ensue. I don't want to spoil anything, even past page 2. So read it if you have not read it. It's brilliant. It's so good. It's so captivating. There's not even words for how absolutely brilliant this is. And so if you haven't had a chance, give this a read. Seriously, read this. 2002, and we are back to Sophie Kinsella with Shopaholic Ties the Knot. I loved this as well. I think there was Shopaholic in New York the year before, but of course the Neil Gaiman trumped that. But I just loved all of these. I loved getting to follow her character. The only kind of downside was that she would kind of backslip in her issues and would then have to rebuild again. But don't we all? Life is never just an upward trajectory. We all have the ups and downs, and so did this character, and I loved these. 2003 is when The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime was released. It is by Mark Haddon, and I really loved this. This is the story of a neurodivergent teenage boy who's got family stuff going on. There's a lot of problems, and he doesn't see the world the typical way. He's not neurotypical, but one of his neighbors, their dog ends up getting murdered, and he has decided that he is going to solve the crime, and somehow that's going to fix everything in his world. And of course it doesn't. There's so much that happens in this story. He's so fascinating to be in his head and to kind of feel the way that he thinks. And I cannot more strongly recommend it if you haven't had this one read yet. 2004 is when Darkly Dreaming Dexter came out by Jeff Lindsay, and it's really good. I will admit that I've only read the first one of this series, but I loved Loved the HBO show Dexter, and I remember probably way more about the series than I remember about the book, but I do remember greatly enjoying that book quite a lot. 2005 is when The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo came out by Stieg Larsson, and this is so good. This one is where it's more mystery than the other suspensey kind of things, but the suspense thriller stuff does come in at points, but the whole time you're trying to solve this mystery, and it was great. You had obviously the girl who was the girl with the tattoo, I can't remember her character name. She had kind of a storyline, and then you had this guy who had been a reporter, I think, and he's the one who's really kind of trying to figure things out, and he's kind of she's helping. It's a heavy plot. There's a lot to it. It's been a long time since I read it, but it's so good. It's another one that should be on my reread list, but I don't have the others in the series. I know that the author passed after the third or fourth book, and someone else has picked it up, and the reviews haven't been great for the continuation, so this one has kind of gone back burner as far as series for me. The next one I talked about also in my Apocalypse video, 2006, is The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and if you want to read the saddest book in the history of the world, read The Road. It is so incredibly sad. So for most apocalypse books, the apocalyptic event happens and it's about kind of trying to rebuild. The thing that's different in The Road is that there's not a possibility for it to rebuild, because the event that caused the apocalyptic event also killed kind of the earth. Nothing can grow. The soil is dead pretty much everywhere. There's no way to grow new plants, which then has killed off any animals that survived the event, which now we're left with whatever food was left over, and then that's it. And there's no way to kind of figure that out, at least as far as the regular people who are trying to survive go. And so it's not one where it's super hopeful. It's one where you're like, what the heck, dude? The whole time. It's so heartbreaking, but it's so good. 2007 brings us 1,000 Splendid Suns. Of all of the books on this list, I have read this one the most. I know I've read this over 20 times. I teach this book, and I've been teaching this book for a while. So I teach seniors. When I have lower level seniors, I do it as a read aloud. I actually studied the benefits of read aloud for struggling readers or for older readers as part of my master's program, and it was a big part of my personal research. So I use this book for that. I also teach it with my honors level kids. They do a first read alone, and then we dig into the text as we go, and it is absolutely beautiful. I've read it, like I said, over 20 times. I still cry at the very last line of this book. It's absolutely the most beautiful, touching, heartbreaking story. It is the story of two women who are in Afghanistan. It starts at the fall of the monarchy. It goes through the Soviet invasion, through the civil war with the Mujahideen, into the takeover from the Taliban, through 9/11 and the US fight against the Taliban, and then into the rebuilding. And you're watching regular people go through that. So it's not war happens in this book, but these aren't war stories. These are the human beings who are trying to survive and have a life with all that is happening, the dangers, the political stuff, like all of it. It's just beautiful, and it's so much about the importance of found family and creating family and treating people like their family, and showing what that really means. And I cannot more strongly suggest it. If you haven't read this, get yourself a big old box of tissue and settle in and You're welcome. Okay, I'm not going to grab everything that I still have, but I do have a special box set of this. 2008, The Hunger Games, and I'm going to go ahead and add 2009 is Catching Fire. I have probably read these the second most after A Thousand Splendid Suns. The Hunger Games are I have to get out of this world that I'm living in right now, and they're the easiest jump into a different world. And it's not a great world. There's a lot of bad that's in the Hunger Games, but it's so fast for me to just leap right into that world and to be able to mentally escape the here and now. That's what I've used them for a really long time, and I love them. They're so good. I have not loved the film adaptations. I am one of the folks who doesn't think Katniss, as she was portrayed in the book, was actually in the films. That's my opinion. I think that they weakened her character quite a bit. They made her very passive, whereas she was the least passive character I think I've ever read. They took that away from her in the film versions, and that bothered me. That being said, I still cannot wait for The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I think it's going to be brilliant. The trailers look amazing. It looks like some of the nuanced things that are in the book that they got, and that I think they're going to be in the film, so I'm super excited for that. 2010 was the year that Room by Emma Donoghue was released. I really loved this book. It's another one that's heavy and super sad. It is about a girl who was a college student. She got grabbed outside, I believe, her dorm or her class, and this man kept her locked in a shed for like a decade, and she had a son with him, and it's about her and the son and living in Room, because that was their world was just Room. And then I'm not going to talk about kind of what happens, but it was so incredibly well done. There was also a lot of these have films. There was also a film version with Brie Larson that really followed the book pretty well, but I strongly suggest the book. If that's not too heavy for you, that's some heavy stuff. If you can handle it, I really suggest it. It was so incredibly well done. 2011, I'm not sure if this is the longest thing on the list or if The Stand was, but it's another Stephen King. It's 11/22/63, and it is over there, but I'm not going to go grab it. It is so good. It is Stephen King, but it is not horror at all. It is actually, I guess you would say, fantasy kind of, maybe sci-fi. It's one of time travel. I'm never sure which genre that kind of falls into, but basically it is about a young man who discovers that there is a door on the back of his local hamburger diner that opens up, and you end up back in time, and you always come out in the same place at the same time. And so he decides, stuff happens that leads him to do this, but he's going to go through the door, and he's going to live back in the late 50s into the 60s, and he's going to attempt to stop the assassination of JFK. And so much stuff happens when he's back there. He goes through all of this, and it's hijinks upon hijinks. So it's not just waiting for one event. He has a full life that happens, and the dominoes that happen with it. It's really well done. It's super immersive. It's very, very long, but it's long in the like, I need this much time to really be in this world with this guy, and I loved it, and I really strongly suggest it. 2012 was a book that really did a humdinger to the mystery kind of thriller genre. After this, everything was about the twists. Everything was about like, how twisty can we make this twist? How shocking can we make this twist? Of course, I'm talking about Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. So it is the story that, at least at the beginning, really seems to follow the Lacey Peterson disappearance. So we have this kind of beautiful couple, and the wife goes missing, and we start seeing things, at least at first, were in the husband's head, and he talks about just how like socially awkward he is, and he keeps making like weird faces and things like that make people think he's guilty, and it's just that he's just really bad at doing the social thing. And so you start like, did he do it, didn't he do it? And then I'm just gonna say, if you haven't read it, hijinks ensue, huge twists that leave you going, what the heck? Where did this come from? If you're reading it now and you've read a lot of those, it's not going to hit as hard as it did back then. But back prior to this, a lot of these type stories were pretty linear, pretty like of course you had twists and turns, but not to this extent. And then everything just went haywire after this. So it was a pretty important piece in the genre, and now it's still one of the best, I think. 2013 is another Neil Gaiman. It is The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and it's such an adorable story. It is very, very short. It is about a very young child and kind of how he's seeing the world. Things are happening that to him seem like they're evilly magical. There's all of this kind of stuff going on, and of course he's little, and so people don't really believe him when he tries to tell them what he thinks is going on. It's too easy to like, oh, stop making stuff up, oh, just go play, whatever. And so we're with him through the frustration of, you know, like everyone is in danger, these bad things are happening and no one will listen to me, and it's just so well done. And again, it's super short. If you haven't had a chance to read this one yet, I strongly suggest it. It's wonderful and it's a quick read. I'm not gonna grab it, it's behind me, but 2014 is Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. This was another one that I had in that apocalypse list, and it is so very brilliant. It is a post-apocalyptic story where 10 or 20 years after the big event that was kind of apocalyptic and not many people survived, there is a traveling troupe of actors, which everybody talks about the actors, but there's also musicians. There's a full orchestra with the Shakespearean actors that go from settlement to settlement and bring music and performing arts into these communities for people who are trying to rebuild life on the planet. Stuff happens, bad stuff happens, like hijinks ensue, but for the most part, it's so phenomenal and it's so wonderful. And it's wonderful to think that there are going to be people who are going to want to bring music. There are going to be people who are going to want to bring Shakespeare. There are going to be people who want to bring these type of arts and make sure that no matter what we've lost, we get to keep these things, that these things remain part of the human experience. And I love that. So I will always recommend this book. 2015 to 2016, and I've talked about them probably half a dozen times on this channel, and that is Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. If you haven't read them and you have any interest in heist fantasy stories, then give this a go. This is Ocean's 11 in a fantasy setting. We compiled all of the different guys and girls. We compiled all of the people to pull off this heist, and we've got ships and pirates and impossible jobs that we have to pull off, and so very good. The only downside is Six of Crows literally ends on a huge cliffhanger, and I would have been furious had I read it when it first came out. Luckily, I had Crooked Kingdom on the shelf so I could jump straight in, which I did, and I absolutely, positively loved them both. It's what introduced me to Leigh Bardugo and Atwood, a bunch of her stuff, and I'm currently reading one of hers, part of my October TBR. So if you would like to see what I think of that, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and that's all I'm going to say about that, so we can move on. We are now to a ton of books that I'm going to say all of them are at the top of my favorites list. 2017 was when Taylor Jenkins Reid released The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I love this book. I have read it 3 times now, and it only came out in 2017. I got book club to discuss it, which just because I wanted other people to love it and want to talk about it with me. It was and still is absolutely one of my favorites. It is about a young woman. She is Latina, and she dyes her hair and she takes on a more Anglo-sounding name so that she can break into Hollywood, which she does. And so it follows her career and all of the husbands that sometimes she used them, sometimes they used her to get ahead in the world. You do find out who the love of her life was. You get so invested in these characters, and Taylor Jenkins Reid is such a good writer that I finished the book and went like, how did I miss her? How do I not know who she is? How have I not seen any of these films? And then it turns out that it's all fictional, but she seems so real that you go looking to, because you want to go watch her movies. That's how real she seems, and it's amazing. 2018 was when Tayari Jones released An American Marriage, and absolutely one of my all-time favorite books. It's so good. It's not super long. It's super, like, it says so much in less than, I think, 300 pages. It is basically that quintessential American marriage. It is a young college-educated couple who supposedly does everything right. They do all of the things that everyone says, well, if you do these things, you don't have to worry. Like, why are you afraid about this, that, or the other? And they do that. And the husband is still incarcerated for a crime that he did not commit. And they had only been married at this point like 13 months, and it pulls them apart. A big part of the center of this book is them writing letters back and forth, and you're kind of seeing them try so desperately to hold on to everything that they worked so hard to achieve, and then the ramifications and what happens. It is absolutely beautiful, and I cannot recommend it more highly. 2019, we are back to Taylor Jenkins Reid with Daisy Jones and the Six. And this was another one just like Evelyn Hugo, where I wanted to hear the music, I wanted to research the band, and neither of them are real. They are completely fictitious. I have not yet watched the series. I'm a little afraid to because of how much I enjoyed the book. Now, I'm not an audiobook person. It's not a good way for me to intake books. It's better for me to kind of read with my eyes, because then I can slow down or speed up as I need to instead of kind of relying on someone else's pace. But for those who do like audiobooks, I've heard this one is absolutely amazing, that it is a multicast, because the entire book is written in interview form. And so for the interview, because that's how the whole thing is, so all of the different characters are in the audiobook. So it really sounds like you're listening to a podcast, or you're listening to like a VH1 behind the music episode, if you're old enough like me to remember what those were. And it's so good. It's so strong. I recommend it so highly. 2020 and 2021 go to TJ Klune. 2020 for The House in the Cerulean Sea, 2021 for Under the Whispering Door. The House in the Cerulean Sea was a total cover buy for me. And I never do that. I always buy books that I have already researched and already know that I'm going to enjoy. And yet I walked into the bookstore, and it was literally, you walk in the door and there was a bookcase right there, and there was that book at my eye level, and I was like, that's the most adorable thing in the world. I don't care if it's good, that's gonna look good on my shelf, I'll just face it outwards. And so I went ahead and bought it, and like 2 months later, I was like, I should try to read that, see if it's any good. And it became my absolute favorite book of all time. I love that book so much. It is about a man named Linus who has this really sad life. His life is so sad, even his cat doesn't like him. And he feels so alone. And he works for Daikami, which is a company that oversees orphanages for magical children. And so he gets asked to go and investigate an orphanage that is off the books because these kids are dangerous. And the kids are amazing and adorable and wonderful, and I just love it so much. I'm not going to tell you anything else. If you haven't read it, read it. It's so incredibly powerful. and so good. So Under the Whispering Door is a lot along the same lines. It's not plot wise, but kind of emotion feeling wise. It's got similar vibes to it. It is about a man who dies, and he was kind of a terrible guy, and he passes, and instead of just going straight to whatever's next, there are these way stations with kind of ferrymen who are there to kind of help you process the fact that you've passed, and it's, you know, help you process then moving on to the next world kind of thing. And so for him, it's this guy named Hugo who runs a tea shop. So he ends up at Hugo's tea shop trying to reconcile the person he was with who he wished that he could have been, and the relationships that he's gaining at the tea shop. Like, it's all just absolutely wonderful and heart-wrenching. I didn't love it as much the first time because I really just wanted Linus and the kids back, and I was just mad that they weren't there. But the second time when I said, okay, this isn't Linus, this isn't the kids, this isn't the island, you need to read this for itself, and I found myself just bawling my eyes out for the last like 20 pages. It was so beautiful and so good and so well written, and it is now also one of my absolute favorite books. 2022 was the year that Barbara Kingsolver released Demon Copperhead, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. It tied with a different book called Trust, which I haven't read yet, but it's on my list. It is absolutely wonderful, heart-wrenching. It is literary fiction. It is not plot-driven. It is character-driven. It follows a young man named Damon who has orange-red hair, so they call him Demon Copperhead, and it goes literally from his birth all the way through his childhood. He ends up at times in foster care. There's a lot of kind of abuse things. He's living in a very poor area of Appalachia during the 90s when the pill mills were kind of in their heyday, and the, oh, we need to take care of people's pain, and it turned into just basically selling scripts and getting already really poor and destitute people addicted to these pain meds, and then what happens to the children in these situations. And it's so good. It's so wonderful. It's so well done. It's so realistic. It has a Pulitzer. I don't know that there's any way to more highly recommend it than that. And the 2023 book I'm going to say for this list is, of course, Fourth Wing. It is, yeah, it's my favorite thing that I've read so far this year. I absolutely do plan to reread it before I go to what I mentioned earlier, was that big book event at Books A Million. I don't know if Barnes & Noble is doing one too. They haven't advertised anything, but a midnight release for a book hasn't happened in a hot minute, and I am here for it. So if you haven't read Fourth Wing, think training schools, think dragons, think military life, think enemies to lovers. It's got all of the things into one book, and I loved it. So that's it. That's me for 50 years of books. I hope that wasn't too long and drawn out for you. I don't know what editing is going to look like, but I'm telling you, I am so excited to be turning 50. My 20s were so much better than anything that happened in my childhood. My 30s were much better than my 20s. My 40s have been the best decade I've gotten to live yet. So if things run true to pattern, my 50s are going to be amazing and fantastic. And I'm so glad that part of my 50s will be you going along with me on my reading journey. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for getting all the way to the end of this video. And I hope that you have an amazing week and that you get to read some really amazing books. Bye.